What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet. Juliet, in Shakespeare's famous Romeo and Juliet, makes this proclamation, and it may be true for flowers, but what about for people? Are our names really just sounds or words that are used to call us over? Well, let's look at it. First of all, we can think about how our names reflect our family's histories and cultures. The last name or the family name or surname is a really good example of this, and it varies from culture to culture. For example, in lots of English-speaking countries, the family name comes at the end of your name, and it is usually from your father's side of the family. In many Spanish-speaking countries, the family name also comes at the end of the name, but you get one last name from each side of your family, so one from your mom, one from your dad usually. And in many East Asian cultures, the family name actually comes at the beginning of the name, and this reflects how many East Asian cultures are more collectivist, or how they focus more on a group, like a family, rather than an individual so much. We can also look at first names, which there are many traditions for in different cultures. For example, the Balinese people in Indonesia, they name their babies based on birth order traditionally. So if you're the first baby, your name choices are Wayan, Putu, or Gede. And if you're the second baby, the choices are Made, Kadek, and Nega, and there's different names as you go further down the birth order. Birth order is also a factor in choosing baby names in the traditional Irish culture. The firstborn son is usually named after the father's father. The firstborn girl is named after the mother's mother. And then the second-born boy is named after the mother's father. The second-born girl is named after the father's mother. And the third boy would be named after the father, and the third girl named after the mother, and so on and so on. In addition to the time or relation to other babies that you're born, there's also important things with timing when it comes to ceremonies for names. For example, in the Catholic and Orthodox traditions, many babies receive their names at their baptism. And in the Hindu tradition, there's a ceremony called the Namakarana that happens 10 to 12 days after the baby's birth, and it's where the family comes and has a feast, and the baby's name that is chosen by the parents is announced to everyone. So, in addition to how our names reflect our pasts, our names can also affect us in our day-to-day lives, and unfortunately not always in a positive way. For example, names can cause people to unfairly judge people when giving people jobs. For example, in 2017, in Canada, Ryerson University and University of Toronto found that resumes with Chinese, Indian, and Pakistani names received 28% fewer interview requests than other resumes. And in 2016, University of Toronto and Stanford University looked at the American job market, and they found that African Americans and Asians, when they whitened their resumes by changing their names and by removing racially related organizations, they saw a 50% higher chance of receiving an interview request. And this isn't just a problem on our continent either. In 2014, the Paris School of Economics and Stanford University sent out 6 resumes and found that the 2 with French names on them had a 70% higher chance of getting an interview. And in 2005, in Sweden, Stockholm University found that immigrants who changed their names to Swedish names earned 26% more than other immigrants. Also, our names can have a significant impact on our mental health. A recent study done by the University of Texas at Austin of 129 gender nonconforming and transgender teens found that having their preferred names used was linked to a drop in depression, suicidal ideation, and suicidal behavior. There's also more subtle ways that names can affect us. There have been studies that have suggested a link between names and our academic performance, our ability to work in groups, and what we choose to invest in with stocks. There was also a study in 2008 done by the University of Michigan that found that with donations to hurricane victims, people with names that had the same initial as the name of the hurricane, they were overrepresented in the group of donors. So it seems like you might be more likely to donate to hurricane victims when your name is similar to the hurricane's name. So in addition to showing our family's past and affecting us in our present, there's also ways that names can predict the future, although more on a large scale rather than for an individual person necessarily. A good example of this is the rise of the use of unisex names in America. And this was investigated by researchers at the name website Nameberry. In 2015, they found that in the last decade, there had been a 60% increase in the usage of unisex names. And they defined this as names where 35% or more were used for one gender, and the rest were given to babies of another gender. So these names included names like Harper, Tatum, and Quinn. And while it is still more likely for a name that was originally used for boys to then be used for girls too, this trend is still very promising for the rise of gender equality in America, because people will grow up with one less strict difference between the genders. And additionally, we can look at last names again. In America at least, women usually take their husband's last names when they get married. But in 2015, the New York Times reported that based on a Google consumer survey, 22% of women married in the 2010s kept their own last names. An additional 10% chose something besides taking their husband's names or keeping their own last names. So that might be hyphenating their last names or legally changing their names, but still continuing to use their original name in an everyday setting. So this is, again, another example of how names can reflect a social trajectory of how people in the future will have fewer gender barriers. So back to Juliet's original question, what's in a name? Well, as we've seen, names can reflect families' cultures and history, so they can affect what we do and what is done to us on a daily basis. They can even be good indicators of the future. So there really can be a lot in a name, much more than meets the eye. Thank you.